You've entered the no religion zone. This is our midweek teaching. We call it the no religion zone because it's a program I had on the radio, and we're not so much on the radio now. We're still thinking about some opportunities to do that down the road. But we had a program called the NRZ, the no religion zone. And that basically meant we do not preach religion, which is anything that has to do with the law, being legalistic, things we have to do in order to get. Jesus is the end of the law. Therefore, it's all grace. There's nothing, look at it like this. There's nothing that we can do to gain or earn anything from God. That's why it's called grace, unmerited favor. You don't merit anything by a list of do's and don'ts. Definitely anything you see in the Bible to do, it's not so much that you do those, it's what the Lord does through you that will line up with His nature and who He is. You know, Jesus came preaching the gospel. That's what we preach. That's what's not being preached today. They say it's the gospel, but get your Bibles, and I want you to turn to Galatians. And we're going to look at this. Galatians chapter 1. They say they're preaching the gospel, but they're not. And I know that's a tall statement. That's a strong statement. That's a controversial statement. But check this out. I didn't say this. This is what the Apostle Paul writes in Galatians chapter 1. And look at verse 6. I marvel that you are turning away or so soon removed, but I marvel that you are turning away so soon from Him who called you in the grace of Christ, to a different gospel. So it's called the gospel. These people were turning away from it. He says, which is not another gospel, but there are some who trouble you and want to pervert the gospel of Christ. Now I've got my 26 translations here, and I want to read from it. Galatians chapter 1. I had to go to Galatians 4, but let's just go to Galatians 1 here and start off. And let's look at this again through the 26 translations. Chapter 1, verse 6. He says, I marvel, that's the King James. One translation says, I am amazed that you are so readily deserting for a different gospel, who called you by the grace of Christ. Another one says, I'm amazed that you are so quickly turning away from Him who called you by the mercy of Christ to some different good news. Here's another translation. I'm dumbfounded that you have so quickly deserted Christ who called you into the grace of God and have gone over to a different gospel. Let's look at another one. I am amazed that you are so soon shifting your ground and deserting Him who called you. See, Paul is equating Christ and gospel. He says, I'm astonished. It's another translation. Here's one. I marvel. They pretty much all do amazed and marvel. I like the dumbfounded. I'm dumbfounded. But I marvel that thus quickly you are moving away from Him that called you in the favor of Christ unto a different glad message. Verse 7, which is another. For other gospel there is none. Here's another one. Not, of course, that it is or ever could be another gospel, which is really no good news at all, but there be some who trouble you and would pervert you into the gospel of Christ. So what I'm saying is, when Paul says gospel, because we've been doing this series, I don't know how long we're going to do them for, law and gospel. But I want you to see something. When we say gospel, it's Christ. Christ is the gospel, the good news. I could easily put on there law or Christ. The Bible says Christ is the end of the law. If Christ is the end of the law, then the gospel is Christ. It's either law or gospel. Just remove the word gospel because I want you to see something. You are deserting Christ when you pervert the gospel. He says it's really not another gospel. So you can't say, hey, they left this gospel for another gospel. He said that in the beginning, but he came back to, but there's really no other gospel. It's just that they have perverted the gospel. But I want you to equate the gospel with Christ. I think that might help your lens, may help you understand the importance of getting it right. We're just not talking about, no, when you pervert the gospel, you have left Christ. You've made Christ of no effect. If you turn the gospel into law or you desert the gospel for law. It's both being done, but mostly it's a deserting of the gospel. It's a perverting of the gospel. Because when you pervert it, you have pretty much gone on to something else. But it's a perversion of the gospel. Let me put it this way. If you preach Jesus and you preach law, you've perverted the gospel. Because this is the deception. I'm preaching Jesus. He died on the cross. He rose again. Well, so didn't they preach that in Galatians? See, this is what amazes me about the church. They haven't taught you right about the book of Galatians. But we're not dealing with the cults here. Or cults. We're not dealing with Jehovah's Witnesses or Mormons or anything like that. We're dealing with people who preach Jesus. This Galatian letter is dealing with these teachers who preach Jesus plus good works. Plus law. That's what Paul's, and that's all we're dealing with in the church today. We are worse off today, and maybe not, I really can't say, but it seems to me we're worse off today than they were even in this day. Because we've added the self-help gospel. We've added the improvement gospel. 12 steps, 4 secrets, 2 keys. It's just not the commandments anymore. Paul was dealing with the Jewish law and its traditions, but we've got our own little traditions now. Our 12-step programs and everything else that we've added to Jesus. Let me put it this way. If you add anything to Jesus, you've just perverted Jesus. Because the gospel is Jesus. The gospel is Jesus. So whatever add-on you want to come up with, you've just perverted Jesus. And Paul calls you perverts here. Let's look at these different translations. He says, but there be some that trouble you and would pervert the gospel of Christ. It simply means that certain individuals are unsettling you. They want to distort the gospel of Christ. But there are obviously men who are upsetting your faith with a travesty of the gospel of Christ. But then I know that you are people who are harassing you and who want to pervert the good news of Christ. So, the word's pervert. In the Greek, what does that mean, the word pervert? Yeah, they're perverting the gospel. We're not going to spend a lot of time on this one today, maybe next week, because the last couple of weeks we've been talking about the tent in Galatians chapter 4. What does that tent signify? And we're going to get to that because I want to go a little bit more further with that. But I want to make it more practical. Maybe you're in the tent and you don't know it. Maybe your friends are trying to get you into the tent. What is the tent? We know that's the law. Going into the tent is going back to the law. But we're going to take that a little further. But I want to say this about this perverting because it goes with the tent. At least I'm going to make it go with the tent today. What does the word pervert mean in the Greek? And we'll deal with this maybe more so next week, but I just want to sidebar it with you here now. Pervert in the Greek means to put the front in the back and the back in the front. Think about it. What did they do to the gospel? They put the front in the back and the back in the front, and that's a perversion. Anytime you put the front in the back and the back in the front of anything, you do something. You pervert it. You can, even just things you buy at the store, if you do the opposite with it, what you're supposed to, it's a perversion. And I don't want to get into the sexual, there's a lot of sexual perversion today that we're doing things we shouldn't be doing. And it's getting the front and the back and the back and the front. But in this context, get out of the sexual context. But in this context, they were putting the law first and grace in the back. Yeah, we believe in grace, but you got to have the law first. Grace doesn't work unless you combine it with law. But they preach law. It's all about preaching law. And so they put the front and the back and the back and the front. And you can't see it from here, but we've got on the board, we've got a whole big, I've put that up there, it's been up there for a long time because I won't erase it. We've got a cross, and then when I do this next week, I may have the chalkboard and show you how we did it up there. Anyway, they're perverts. Anytime someone is trying to add on, they are perverting the gospel. And according to Paul, come on. Now, I know he doesn't actually sit there and say, hey man, they're perverts. But come on, is it not inferred? Think about it. If someone takes something and uses it for something, and they pervert it and use it for something else, it's not that thing's fault. It's the guy who's using it for his own perversions. So these guys are actually taking the gospel and perverting it, which makes them perverts, because the gospel can't be perverted unless someone who's a pervert is perverting the gospel. I think I have every right, and Paul does, that these people, and we don't do this today. Come on, the church is too politically correct. You think the government's bad about or these different parties and groups are, you criticize them for the political correctness that's going on? Church has never ever done what Paul said to do. Cast the bondwoman out and her son, because they are the perverts who are perverting the gospel. You got to put the whole context together of the book of Galatians. We won't cast the bondwoman out. I may have a doctor in my church, and he probably gives like as much as 20 families. But I can't if he's perverting the gospel, my job is to cast him out. If he's bringing legalism here, little leaven leavens the whole lump, Paul says. You cast them, you ask them to leave, because they are perverting the gospel. We ask people to leave who sin. We don't ask people to leave who pervert the gospel. And I don't even think we should ask people to leave who sins. I think Galatians 6:1 is pretty adamant in it's you really ought to be able to figure it out yourself. If you see a brother stumble, sin, you who are spiritual, restore such a one. No, we don't. We got it ass backwards. That's why the church is perverted. If you pervert the message, then the church is perverted, because the church stands on its message. If the message is perverted, that church is perverted. And the pastor's a pervert and the congregations are perverts. I know. See, that's what I'm saying. This is why this is the no religion zone. Because I feel like we're not being straightforward or honest about these scriptures. And we're definitely not doing it. See, now I'm going to camp out here for a minute. Paul says, I marvel, or I'm dumbfounded, I'm amazed, depending on your translation you're looking at, that you are so soon removed from this gospel that he presented to them. This is his church. These are his kids. It's not like he came along like with the Roman church or the church at Antioch, where he withstood Peter, who was a legalist. And wait till I get to James in Acts chapter 13 and teach it the way history says it, not what tradition says. And wait till you see what we do with the book of James and what we do with Peter. Peter came to the church that Paul taught them grace and played the hypocrite. So much so that Paul's right-hand man, Barnabas, got caught up in legalism and law. You ever wonder why Paul was adamant not to bring Mark along? Remember that sharp argument that Barnabas and Paul got into, and they split their ways, and Barnabas took Mark and Paul took Titus. I think it was Titus. Or Silas. He took Silas with him. Paul took Silas, Barnabas took Mark. Why was Barnabas so adamant about keeping Mark? And what axe did Mark have to grind with Paul that made Paul so adamant that this guy is not going with us? Tradition says, he's a flake, and Paul was... No. That's not what it was. It's not what it was. There is history to show that Mark was a legalist and didn't completely agree with Paul, because who did Mark grow up with? Who was Mark's teachers? God, I'm already doing this, and I didn't want to do it. I'm going to say this and stop, because this is a whole can of worms we're going to get into in the weeks to come that I'm telling you is going to blow your mind. I've got things I haven't put on. I did the Galations verse by verse. I've got stuff that's not even on there, that's never been spoken even in this church, that we're going to get into. But who was Mark's teachers? It wasn't Paul. It wasn't Paul. It was Peter, James, not the James that got beheaded around the time that Stephen got stoned. We're talking about the half-brother of Jesus, who was the pastor at the church in Jerusalem. Mark was brought up under there. And you got to know they're still under law, because in Acts chapter 13, James couldn't win the debate over circumcision, but even told Paul, well, let them do the kosher laws. He had to give him something. Do something. You got to do something. And Paul said, well, I'm here to win the debate on circumcision. So yeah, well, Paul should have went all the way. You know, think about it. The kosher laws. Law is law, folks. And anyway, the kosher laws that James comes up with in Acts 13 is the laws out of Leviticus, that if foreigners wanted to be part of the Jewish custom, if they were in town or whatever, these were the ones they had to go by just to be accepted. That's what James thought of the Gentiles. Give them the kosher laws. They're the foreigners. No, they're Abraham's seed. They're not foreigners. You don't treat them like second class. See, the Jews treated Gentiles like second class citizens, and they at least had to do the kosher laws. You're not going to tell me that James knew grace. You're full of you-know-what if you think James knew grace. And if Peter had to be confronted by Paul in Galatians chapter 2 at the church at Antioch, you know he wasn't completely free. I'm telling you, they're not being straightforward with history. You're being passed down a bunch of traditions is not true. And the whole thing is, they're perverting the gospel. And we've been perverting the gospel since Paul called it that. Luther had to come and do his thing. And every 500 years it seems like God... And we are in the 500th year, by the way, of the Reformation. I think it's in October of this year, if I'm not mistaken, or maybe it was last year. But the 500th year is either just came or it's coming. I can't remember now. But nevertheless, we're in the 500 years. So God's got to raise up some more grace preachers and teachers. And I'm not talking about those who mix grace and the faith message on TV today. That's still... The faith message today is still legalism. Got you doing things. Anyway, what are we talking about here? Paul's saying... Now, this is why I like... When you know the book of Galatians, you can start putting it together in ways most people can't, because Luther said he read the book of Galatians every 6 months to stay free. That's Martin Luther says that he had to read the book of Galatians every 6 months to stay free. And then he said, I'm married to the book of Galatians. This is really, if you let this sink in, this book is way more important than maybe what you've given credence to. But Paul says, or not Paul, but Martin Luther said he read it every 6 months to stay free. I think he actually did verse by verse 2 times. He taught it verse by verse 2 different times. And he named it, he said, I'm married to it, and he named it after his wife, Catherine. So that shows you that this book was everything to him. And it should be to us as well, because the gospel is still being perverted. The book of Galatians keeps us from perverting the gospel. And the gospel is to make the grace message. That's another thing. Everybody, grace message. The grace message is the gospel. God, people are so stupid. I'm sorry. I'm not trying to be mean, but there's a lot of people who have no business preaching and teaching in the church today, and even to be on TV. Unbelievable. Unbelievable. So what's happening here? You've got perverts trying to get you to go to the tent. We've been talking about the tent for the last 2 weeks. What does the tent signify? I'm not saying this. Paul makes the allegory. An allegory is giving you a picture of what he's trying to convey to you. So in the first 2 chapters of Galatians, he's basically just giving you an introduction of the temperature of what's going on in that church, so he can get into 3 and 4, which is a theological. And you'll find the tent in chapter 4. He's being very theological with you, but he wants to paint a picture, which he comes up with this allegory of Hagar and Sarah and Abraham and Isaac and Ishmael. All those 4 players came out of that tent. Have to do with the tent. And he equates the tent. I don't. Thank God that Paul came up with this. And let me tell you something. If you think I'm wrong, you're nuts. And you have no understanding in this. But if if Billy Graham would have came up with this allegory, they wouldn't have accepted it. Because this is one crazy allegory. No man in the history could have came up with this, and they would have received it. Thank God that the Father didn't give it to somebody later in the years, because we would never accept the allegory. No one would ever equate going into the tent, Hagar, with the 10 Commandments. Who would put the 10 Commandments in that tent? I mean, the holy 10 Commandments. I mean, the whole Mount Sinai. If you came near it, you died. I mean, the people feared it, and they said, "No, we're not going anywhere. No, Moses, you go up there. Whatever you hear God say, you come back down. Whatever He tells you, we'll do it." I mean, that was the holy mountain. And the 10 Commandments, that's what's in the Ark of the Covenant. I mean, we're talking holy stuff here. And God takes that holy 10 Commandments that came off of Mount Sinai and equates it to going into the tent with Hagar. No man could have pulled that allegory off. We wouldn't have ever accepted it. We would have said, "There's no way, you're nuts." But thank God that He didn't give it to anybody else but Paul, who wrote 2/3 of the New Testament. You got to deal with this. And I love it. But no one deals with it because they don't want it. I mean, if you're being a legalist, you're going into the tent. You're going to do the very thing. You're going to produce an Ishmael. All your works are going to be wood, hay, and stubble, because that's what comes out of the tent. Anything that comes out of the law, any type of working, a principle, a system, a law, faith principles. Now the new thing is spiritual principles. Just another word for law. I mean, Paul even said the law's spiritual, the law's good. Don't give me spiritual laws. That's legalism. It's legalism. So Paul says these are perverts. Now, going back to the tent, let's go to chapter 4. And let's look at verse, I think it's 21. Chapter 4, verse 21. Yeah. I think Paul should have opened up with this verse. I'm just saying. Because I go straight to this verse. From now on, when I teach Galatians, I'm going to start with this verse and then go to chapter 1. Just this verse. Tell me, you who want to be under the law. Just stop right there. I just don't understand how people can even want to be anywhere in any degree, let's put it that way, any degree of legalism. When Paul makes a statement, tell me, you who want to be under the law, right off the bat you know the law is wrong. Just by Paul, tell me, you who want to be under the law. Do you not know what the law says? And he goes right into the allegory of the tent with Hagar and Abraham. Hagar represents a slave woman. Slavery. Hagar represents the 10 Commandments. Abraham tried to produce God's promise of Isaac by going into working a system that he could do in the flesh. And the tent and Hagar represent the law. And he says you produce bondage. When you engage the law, you produce Ishmaels. You produce children of bondage, because that woman's bondage. And he said the church in Jerusalem, which is now, he says is in bondage. And guess who was pastoring that church? James. He said, men sent from James came to spy out our liberty. Men from James? Why would he include the man James if they weren't connected, these spies? Well, what were they doing? Well, wait till we get to that. Wait till we get to how were they spying them out? This is some crazy stuff. You're not going to believe me, but it's there in Scripture. History proves it. So tell me, you who want to be under the law. Do you know what the law says? And he goes into the tent. So let me see where I want to be practical today, because we pretty much drew some conclusions last week and the week before about the tent, but I want to be a little bit more practical in our conclusions. Not theologically bringing theological conclusions, but I want to bring some practical conclusions that the Lord laid on my heart, especially even today, actually, that I believe will be helpful to you. Because if this is not liberating you, I'm not doing this as just a history lesson or just to tell you what the Greek says, tell you what the context is, and just be cute with our message. No, it has to be life transforming. You have to encounter, if what I'm doing is not resulting in you encountering Jesus, who is grace, who is the grace message, we're wasting our time. So that's why I want to get a little practical with you today. So tell me, you who want to be under the law. You know what the law says? He goes into the tent. And I want to give you some illustrations of what it means to go into the tent. What does it actually mean to go into the tent? And I gave just a hint of it just about 5-10 minutes ago with the faith teachers. And then I want to get into something I think is just as good. But I was listening the other day. Oh, I don't remember who it was. But they were talking about David and Saul, and how David was being chased by Saul, goes into the cave, cuts the piece off, and shows it to Saul, and even felt bad. Now, you know the story. This guy makes this statement. Not the one I was listening to, but he had a guest on there, and the guest made this statement. I think the guy I listened to has also made this statement, but it doesn't matter that it's wrong. But listen to what he says, and I hear this across the board, especially with the faith teachers, and pretty much everybody's gleaning from faith teachers. So they're pretty much all saying this, and you're going to know it too, because I know you've heard this. But he made this statement that David was able to not get offended and exercise grace and mercy, blah, 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 towards Saul. And that's all true. But here's where he makes his mistake. He says, you know, this ability to forgive and to forbear and suffer, he says, see, he said it's a spiritual law. These are spiritual laws that we work. And I'm like, man, no. It hit me like a ton of bricks. This is just this week. I said no to myself. No, and just like the Lord just came down and spoke something to me when I didn't. I just felt like the Spirit within me saying no, and then God backed it up. You do what you want, whether I heard God or not. I think the proof will be in the pudding, because you'll see what I'm about to say is being true. And I'm like, and I got irritable, and I said, you know what? I am so sick of these faith teachers. Spiritual laws, there are biblical principles. Those are the two things. I could go on with other synonymous terms they use. But those are the two main ones. There are biblical principles for you to obey to get results. There are spiritual laws to be obeyed to get results. So whether they call them spiritual laws or biblical principles. And when he said it's a spiritual law, I said no. What David did was not a spiritual law or a biblical principle. What he did was he released the nature of God. What did God say about David? There's a man after my own heart. What does that mean, to be after God's heart? That means that man has my nature. That's all that means. He just revealed my nature. He didn't reveal. God is not a law. God is a nature. He's a person. And there are not spiritual laws. That's Old Covenant. There are not biblical principles. That's Old Covenant. What the New Covenant is, you are one with Jesus. and it's an organic union of John 15, and you are unveiling Christ. Oh yeah, you can call it let's say for instance that I did something. And it was, I did this and I got a result. Well, somebody can say that's a biblical principle and probably prove it in the Bible that it was. Or that's a spiritual law. But that is a human way of looking at it from the outside in. It's not a biblical principle. You may find what I do being biblical. And you may find what I do as a law of some sort, because he does write the law in our hearts. But they're never ever to be looked at through that lens with us anymore. Because when I make it a principle and when I make it a spiritual law, I make Christ of none effect. Because at that point I'm exercising in the flesh some spiritual law. David did not exercise a spiritual law. He released the nature of God that God put within him as king. What does Peter say in 2 Peter chapter 1? We are partakers of his divine nature. I'm not partaking of divine laws, spiritual laws, biblical principles, because the minute I get into spiritual laws and biblical principles, I'm going into the tent. And it's going to produce a result, and guess what his name is? Ishmael. And God says, when you bring that to me, at the judgment seat of Christ, it's going to be wood, hay, and stubble. The Holy Spirit. Isn't it funny that the Spirit burns that stuff up? Huh? It's going to be tried by fire. You know why? Because the Spirit says, I didn't do that in you. That wasn't a release of God's nature. That was you working a system called biblical principles, spiritual laws. We are partaking of a nature. And we're unveiling that nature. We're partaking of it. And it's being manifested. It's not me working a principle or a key or a secret. It's me being transformed by Jesus and releasing it. Christ is working through me. And these men are calling them spiritual laws. No, they're called fruits of the Spirit. They're called fruits, which is a result of being transformed. So the Spirit transforms me. I end up being a certain way. And you can't call it a biblical principle or a spiritual law. It is the fruit of God's nature that I'm partaking of that's coming out of me. I hope you're hearing that. Because I'm telling you, I'm right on. And I don't normally say I'm right on. But that one came from the Spirit, and I've got the Bible to back me up, and I know that I'm right. I know that makes me be in opposition with most preachers on TV. I am not going to point you to spiritual laws and biblical principles, because that's an external thing written on paper that your flesh will want to try to obey. And that's going into the tent. That's why Paul says the tent is equated to the Ten Commandments and Mount Sinai, because it's all external. It's not God doing it by promise. See, God told Abraham, I'm going to give you a son. I'm going to open up your wife's womb. That means you got to trust me to do it. Going into the tent is you working a system. You doing it by the flesh. You doing it in the natural. Biblical principles, spiritual laws, they can be written on paper. They can be put in a book for your flesh to obey. And that's Hagar. And that's going into the tent. That's any type of law. Not just the Ten Commandments. It's any law, any principle, any key that they tell you to do. And they all want you in that damn tent. So you tell me, you who want to be under the law. You know what the law says? Let's talk about the tent. Let's talk about the law. Let me tell you something else too, and I'm going to make a lot of people mad here. But I am not called to make friends and influence people. I'll say this down the road, but let me sidebar something here. Isn't it amazing that the pastor of the church in Jerusalem had been there 19 years and never created one riot, never had to worry about being beaten with rods or anything like that? Paul comes on the first day there, causes a riot, and has to be snuck out of Jerusalem, thrown in jail, had to be snuck out of Jerusalem, buy a basket, and get out of Dodge. How does a man called James pastor a church in Jerusalem for 19 years and never have to suffer and have the attacks the Apostle Paul did when he showed up in Jerusalem? Doesn't make sense, does it? Because one was preaching law, which was acceptable, and the other was preaching grace, which is no law, and they beat the hell out of him. I just want you to think about that. 19 years and you don't make any, you never suffer, you're never in, but boy, you bring Paul in there, and man, a riot breaks out. And when he went back after 14 years, he goes back again, and you know what happened. Well, the last time he was in Jerusalem, you know what happened. That's when he appealed to Caesar and ended up going to Rome. Because James told him to go in there and do some purification laws. That was a setup. You mean tell me James didn't realize that Paul was going to get, and why Paul agreed? I don't know. He made a mistake. Not these guys aren't perfect. No apostles. Just because an apostle doesn't make him perfect. And again, but I'm just throwing this stuff together because if anything, I'm just giving you seeds for where we're going to go when we get to the church in Jerusalem, especially the guy who pastored it. But I want you to see something here. These people, and this is why I'm going to make you mad. I'm going to make some people mad. What does it mean? There's no reason to preach the tent and Hagar if we're not going to reduce it down to practical measure to where you can, see it and say, oh my God, that's what's happening today. Besides people like the faith teachers, they want you in the tent with their spiritual laws and biblical principles. But there's another group of people, and they pretty much, they can be anywhere, but they're pretty much in the churches that have now reduced their worship to 20 minutes, their sermons to 20 minutes, and you're out the door within an hour. The seeker-friendly churches. They're more motivational and self-help than anything, and this is where you're going to find this group of people, is the 12-step program people, the Celebrate Recovery people. That's going into the tent. Sorry, because it's something for you to do. It's 12 things to do, 12 ways to be. I know I'm going to make people mad. I'm telling you, the Celebrate Recovery is no different than the 10 Commandments. 12 steps, 10 Commandments. They all are equated down to do something. Do something. And what did we learn? What's Paul trying to tell us about Abraham with Hagar in that tent? You tell me you want to be under the law. You know what the law says? 12 steps, tent. 4 secrets, tent. 3 keys, tent. Here's my new CD series on biblical principles, tent. Hey, brother, it's about the spiritual laws, tent. It's them getting you into the tent. Well, I don't know. Let's look at Romans chapter 8. Get your Bible. I'm going to read it out of I'll read it out of the New King James, and then I'm going to read it out of the Amplified. And you wait till you tell me what are you going to do with this. See, what's the purpose of going into the tent? Okay, let's back up. So Paul goes to Genesis. He says, "You tell me, you who want to be under the law. Tell me, you who want to be under the law." And he goes to Genesis. Why does he go to Genesis? There's no 10 Commandments in Genesis. Because it wasn't the Abrahamic covenant, which is a foreshadow of the new covenant, which is all faith, which is trusting in grace. Really, it's grace. Faith receives. Faith doesn't do. It receives what's already been done. Faith doesn't do, it receives what's already been done, and the cross is the finished work. Already been done. All the benefits, everything there is already done. That's why Jesus gets to the right hand of the Father and is seated at the right hand, because the work is done. When a man sits, that means he's done working. We're seated in heavenly places. We're done working. When we get saved, we're done working. Now our faith is to receive what all Jesus has accomplished. Right? No, Hebrews 4 tells us that. We need to cease from our works as God ceased from his works on the seventh day. No more working. Yeah, but doesn't faith end in a work? We'll get into that, but it's a work that the Spirit's doing through you. It's not your work. It will have nothing to do with your flesh either. It doesn't originate with your flesh. It's not your energy. It's all God in you working through you. For it is God who is at work in you to will and to do. For it is God who is at work in you to do. It's all his work. Faith just receives, rests in, and God works through us. And it ends up in some type of manifestation. Call it a fruit, call it a work. I don't know what, call it a manifestation. We'll develop that more down the road. But I want to show you something here. Romans chapter 8. This ought to be, it has become my favorite verse in the whole Bible. Right here. And it should be everybody's. That's a big, should be everybody's favorite verse. Now, Greg, you're telling me what my favorite verse ought to be. Well, we'll read it. Tell me what you want. Tell me, you who want a favorite verse. You know what the Bible says? Romans 8, verse 32. He, God, who did not spare his own son Jesus, but delivered him up for us all. Here we go. How shall God not with Jesus? So let's read it now. How shall he not with him also freely give us all things? Now wait a minute. Why did, go back to Genesis. This is where the allegory comes from. Now we know why Paul uses Galations or Genesis, because there's no law there. That's why he uses Abraham, because it's an Abrahamic covenant. Tell me, why did Abraham go in that tent? Let's just really make it practical here. Why did Abraham go in that tent? To produce something. So he goes in there in his own fleshly effort to produce a fleshly work called Ishmael. God lets it happen. And God says, "Oh, I see what you did there. But he ain't the one. He's not the one. Cast the bondwoman out and her son, because the two can't grow up together in the same home, which is grace and law. Free people and slavery people cannot grow up together. They like water and oil, they don't mix. Grace and law does not mix. You can't preach law and expect God to grace you. They're opposites. It doesn't even work that way. You don't understand law then at that point. You don't understand the reason for grace. So Abraham went into that tent to produce something. What am I trying to do 12 steps? I'm trying to produce something. I'm working these 12 steps to produce something in my life, to get a result. Abraham went in that tent with Hagar to produce something. And he went, and why? He bypassed promise. At that point, he's doing it. He's not waiting on God. And we are children of promise. For God gave it to Abraham by promise. Everything under the new covenant now is by promise. Because why? It's freely given. If it's freely given, you don't got to go into the tent. If it's freely given, I don't have to do spiritual laws or operate with biblical principles or work the word and watch the word work. Work the word and the word works. I don't got to do any of that. If it's free, no law. What is grace? Unmerited favor. Let me read this in the Amplified now. If the New King James didn't do it for you. He who did not withholding or spare even his own son, but gave him up for us all, will he not also with him freely and graciously give us all other things? You know what Paul's doing here in Romans 8. He's arguing from the lesser to the greater, or from the greater to the lesser. He says, look, the best thing God could have done for us, the greatest gift that God could have given us was Jesus. And if he gave us his best, will he not freely give us the rest of everything else in life? And he clearly says that. Will he not freely give us all things? So your deliverance is free. I don't got to go work 12 steps to get it. But I do have to wait on God to fulfill His promise of deliverance. And that's where the problem is. Nobody wants to wait for the growth. Nobody wants to wait for the transformation. Did Abraham want to wait for Isaac? It took 25 years, but after 13 he went to the tent, couldn't wait no longer. So we sit there, and I've got this alcoholic problem for so many years now. I got to do something because he sure ain't. So he's going to go into the tent. He's going to go to a 12-step program because God hasn't done anything yet. We can't wait for God. That's what I'm saying. John 15 is an organic union, and it takes time to produce fruit. It takes time to manifest. We are not perfect, so we cannot produce perfect works. There are going to be things in my life that may take a little longer than maybe in your life, but it's not me working. It's God working in me, and I have to wait for God to fulfill the promise. Until then, this is who I am. I'm telling you, this has to do with the homosexuals and lesbians that are in churches today. It's because you cannot mandate them to change overnight. Drug addicts, alcoholics, you cannot mandate them to change. Or just a simple little trek up to the altar is not going to change them. Making confessions are not going to change them. It's them in Christ waiting for God to fulfill the promise. Until then, we forbear, we forgive, we restore, we stand with them who's struggling. I really don't like it. I only use the homosexuals and lesbians because the church doesn't know how to handle them. I'd rather use you people with pride and you're gossiping than because we're all bad. We're all bad. Paul says, I'm chief of sinners. So we don't even do the degree of sin here. We don't say this one over that one and that one over this one. No, we are all sinners, and we're just trusting God. If God doesn't deliver me, then you got to accept me for who I am. Simple as that. It's because you're not preaching against law. You're not preaching law. You're not preaching against sin. You're not preaching law. To preach law is to preach against sin. Nope. I don't preach against sin because your sins are forgiven. Why preach about something you're forgiven? And why preach on law? Because the power of sin is the law. Well, that ain't going to work either. So we don't preach against sin and we don't preach law. And that makes them all mad. Makes them all mad. No man after the flesh. If he says, I'll take your sins and cast no sea of forgetfulness, never to remember it again, or as far as the east is from the west, I'll remove your sin from you, never to remember it again. That's one of the things of the new covenant is, I will remember your sins no more. And why are we browbeating each other over? What are we condemning each other? If there's no condemnation in Christ, then what am I supposed to do with your sin? Remit it. Forgive it. Move on. Point to Jesus. Point to grace. Grace is the only true deliverance of all sin. But let's get back to here. Freely give you all things. But you got to wait for them. So let's say, for instance, God gave, I'm trying to make this so simple, and I know I'm belaboring this thing, but what's the point if you're not getting this to even do it? The whole point of doing this is you get it. I'm looking for that proverbial light bulb to go up, boom, and you get it. So Abraham, this is telling me you want to be under the law. Let's look at the tent. So Abraham was going into the tent to produce something because he wasn't waiting on the promise of God to do it. So he got in the flesh and did it himself. Well, let's say that is a promise for Abraham to have a son. Well, let's say your promise that God gives you, which is a general promise, that I'm the God that healeth thee. Right? Is that not a promise? God the healer? So what happens is, we have people now writing books on what you need to do to secure that you get healed. These are 10 things. And this is the big one. Make sure you forgive. Make sure you forgive. Because if you don't forgive, God can't heal you. So you're like, oh, I just put you in the tent. Now you're going to go in that tent and work forgiveness. Wait, no, I don't got to forgive anybody to get healed. Jesus proved that. How many people did he heal, but he never asked to have them forgive everybody that they may have ought against? Huh? That's a lot of BS being thrown around. That's that's going to always be one of the things to do to get healed. Forgive. Now, I'm sure we should all forgive, but I'm telling you, how about people? You know, there have been people that got saved and healed at the same time. What, you tell me they never had unforgiveness in their heart toward people? I guarantee you that people that have gotten saved and healed had unforgiveness. How'd they get healed if there was unforgiveness in them? Huh? See, this is how I think. Most people won't go the next tier of thinking. They won't go any deeper than just the shallow. They just hear what someone says. Oh, I want to be healed. I got to forgive. I was in Pennsylvania, big church, Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, big church. And they had a guy from California, the LA, Orange County area, that has a gigantic church. If I said his name, you'd know it. That's not who I came to hear. I came to hear somebody else. We got there that night, and we saw that we got there early. Hey, they're having a meeting, so-and-so. I don't know this guy very well, but yeah, we'll go listen to him. And he gave us 20 things to do to be healed. I got through like 3 or 4, and and I didn't know the people that I was with, what they would feel or think, but I didn't care. I got up and I left. I cannot endure this any longer. And I knew he had 17 more things to give me. And he wrote a book. His book was back there too. So this is not some isolated incidents. This is everybody pretty much on TV. This is what you got to do in order to get. Whether it's healing, deliverance. On the deliverance side, it's Celebrate Recovery. It's the 12-step program. On the healing side, it's forgiveness. On the prosperity side, it's giving. It's sowing. Come on, think about this. Now, this is all new to me. This is coming to me. Everybody's got their own little flavor that they're teaching on. So the prosperity teachers, their big thing to get prosperous is to give. The healing, their big thing to be healed, you've got to forgive. The deliverance crowd who preaches deliverance, their big thing is Celebrate Recovery, 12-step, cleansing stream. They all have their own programs and formats of things you got to do, which is getting you into the tent. I hope you're getting, because you know what? This kills this kills all programs, all those kind of books of things to do when it's freely given to me. So let's go back to the tent. Why did Abraham go into that tent? Abraham got this promise. His wife was barren. Now watch, it took 25 years to get this promise. I don't know what, was it year 10 that he went into the tent with Hagar? After so many years, his wife Sarah comes up with this idea, hey, let's do it this way. Since it's been 10 years and God hasn't opened up my womb, maybe we can help God out in the flesh. Let's go into the tent. You have sex with your maidservant that you picked up in Egypt that shouldn't have been in the first place. Pick her up, bring her in there and have sex with her, and that will be the kid. God says, no, that's not going to be the kid. His name's Ishmael, and he's got to go. It's wood, hay, and stubble. Come on, think this through with me. Now, let's say you're an alcoholic. And you've got the promise that God's your deliverer. You've got the finished work. What Jesus did on the cross. How long are you going to wait for God before you go into the tent, which is the 12-step program? See, after so many years, you'll be tempted beyond measure to go try to fix it yourself. Someone, remember I said last week I said either you're in the tent. If you're in church that preaches legalism, you live in that tent. You go to church every Sunday in that tent. Because most pastors always are giving you, I would say 90+% of pastors every Sunday morning are going to give you something to do. And that's you in the tent. If you don't go to a legalistic church and you're not into the tent, then I guarantee you you're surrounded by people always trying to get you into that tent. How about this? You're an alcoholic. Well, brother, you need to do the cleansing stream. Because you'll get delivered from alcoholism if you do the cleansing stream. And that's the thing came out of Jack Hayford's church that went around for, I don't know if they still even have that. The other one is the 12-step program. And then now the church grabbed a hold of it, call it Celebrate Recovery. See, everybody's trying to get you into that tent. Come on. They see your problem. They don't look at the promise. They look at the tent, which is law. I'm not telling you this. Paul said, tell me you want to be on what the law is. The law is the tent. The law is the 10 commandments. The law is anything that you got to do that bypasses promise. And you having to have faith and wait for God. Through faith and endurance, Hebrews says, we inherit the promises of God, not by going into the tent and working a system. It's through faith and patience, and that word is endurance. Waiting. And that's what Abraham endured, 25 years to get that promise. How long are you willing to wait? When you got half the church breathing down your neck to do something to get rid of your problem. I just don't like your sexualness. So you need to do this. Because I can't stand you being around me. We got to fix you ASAP. I ain't got 25 years to wait for God to do it. Hey, we've come up with programs to fix you. Called the tent. And how many trips do you got to go to the tent? So you go to the tent, it didn't happen. You went through the 12 steps, you're still an alcoholic. Let's go through them again. And let's go through them again. We keep you in the tent. We never point you to the promise, the finished work that it's already done. So now rest. And wait. For God to transform you from the inside out, not externally doing principles and keys and spiritual laws from the outside in. Okay, we'll deal with this some more maybe. I got one more thing and I'm going to close out. I think we're almost in this thing an hour anyway. Let me shift complete gears because this is all. Every day you live either by law or by gospel. You're either trusting the promises of God or you're working a system of do's and don'ts, biblical principles, or spiritual keys, spiritual laws. Every day, you are either living out of the law of doing or out of promise, which is trusting and resting. Faith and promise go together. Works and law go together. So when you say faith, you're talking promise. When you say works, you're talking law. Now, I had this incident happen to me millions of times, over and over again. And it's going to happen to me a whole lot more. So I'm not isolating any particular people or individuals, but it's happened to me. And I know when I get done talking, you're going to say, well, that's happened to me too. And what is that? Well, being offended. When I leave this church today, and I go out there, I don't have any control over how people treat me or what they do or don't do to me. And I have people that could want to harm me, talk about me, which we've seen. Let me ask you, have you had people talk about you? Had you have people tell lies about you or take a little bit of truth and then fill it with a bunch of lies and make it worse than what it is? Have you ever been fired from a job because of somebody? Have you been cheated on in a marriage? Have you had that happen to you? Have you had somebody cause you to be demoted from the position that you're at? Removed falsely or wrongly? Any of the above. This happens to people every single day. It's not something that's strange. It's not something that happens once in a blue moon. But it's an offense. It happens every single day. Well, this week, and this is where I want to go with this. I'm going to close with this. This is really going to be practical, and it's about the tent. I have a family in my church that just had something happen to them that was wrong. Somebody did something that was wrong, and they kind of saw it coming and shared it with me, and I said, boy, if that happens, I'm even going to get offended. I mean, because, it's wrong. It would be wrong. Well, it did happen. It was a political motive thing. It was politics behind it. It was blackballing behind it. You put it all together, it was wrong. It was injustice that was done to them. As they have been done to me. And they have been done to you. Now check this out. So anytime there has been an injustice done against you, and you fill in the blank, was you cheated on? Did you get fired? Did someone lie about you? Did you get taken out of a position that you should have been promoted in or kept in or whatever? Did you miss a promotion because someone lied about you? All the above. Now, what's our first knee-jerk reaction to when an injustice happens to us? We want justice. When an injustice happens, the result is we want justice, and more so than not, we take it into our own hands, and we get into the battle. We engage the battle. We do some confrontation. We do some troubleshooting. We do some talking. We create an alliance of people, because now we've engaged this thing. This is like that board, remember the old 70s game Risk, where you get your alliances, and now we are creating World War III here. We do it. We make the phone calls. We get the people on our side, and we begin this whole Risk. I think that was the name of the board game, Risk. And we've created a world war in our little circle. Because by God, this injustice will be fixed. And we always say, vengeance is mine, say the Lord, but we engage. Now, Paul makes a statement here. Turn this, because you got to see this in Galations chapter 5. I want to show you this. See, because when I engage the injustice, you know what we're acting in, the flesh. Because we are going to do this. We're going to make this right. We're going to fix this. We're going to do this, that, and the other. Now watch Galatians. I want to show you something. Because watch, man, I hope you get this. Is that when I engage the battle, I'm doing something. When I make the phone call, I'm doing something. When I sit the person down to give them a what for, I'm doing something. And Paul says that tent is not just 10 commandments. It's doing something in the flesh, because you can't trust the promise of God to perform the promise, God to be in charge, God to move, God to author the thing, engineer and orchestrate ways and means. You can't trust God to do it, so I'm going to come up with a plan. And I'm going to engage that plan. That is something you're doing. And that's a work of the flesh. And Paul says, that's Galatians chapter 5, verse 4. If you turn to the law of doing, you've just, well, this one says estranged, and I don't like that. I do not like that. I see what the 26 translation says. We got a few minutes here. I hate that I usually like the King James or New King James, but I know there's more. There's other ones here. Let's see what they got. Galatians chapter 5. Give me a second to get there. It's harder to find things in this 26 translations. Galatians chapter 5. And by the way, for you Bible students, everybody ought to have a 26 translations Bible. Galatians chapter 5, verse 4. You are severed from Christ. When you go by a work, a law, something you're doing, because the whole thing is we're children of promise. And when we don't trust God to perform, we're doing it in the flesh. He says when you do that, you have severed from Christ. You are severed from Christ. You are, let's just go with severed. Now watch this. Christ has become no effect to you. That's the King James. You've severed yourself from Christ. He says, and you have fallen from grace. We think if somebody sins, they've fallen from grace. Sinning is not falling from grace. It's when you choose to not trust promise, using your faith to trust promise, and you get into the flesh using a law to work, that's falling from grace. Abraham going into that tent, put it all together here, Abraham going into the tent is falling from grace. It doesn't mean you're not saved. The book of Galatians has nothing to do with salvation, getting saved. It has to do what to do once you're saved. You don't get saved by the works of the law, and you don't continue by going, like he said, you start off in the spirit, you're going back to the flesh. You don't get saved by works, and you don't continue the thing on by works. It's all by grace and faith. I want you to see that when you get into the flesh and do anything, rather than wait on your faith waiting on promise, trusting promise, you've fallen from grace. So let's say, for instance, there was an injustice done to you. And you go, I'm going to get him back. I'm going to save my job. I'm going to save my career. I'm going to save my reputation. I'm going to do something. I'm going to talk. I'm going to get with these people. I'm going to make a phone call. I'm going to do something. You have removed grace out of the situation. Because that's not, grace is this. See, but I know this is hard. Because when an injustice is done to me, it hurts. People start talking about me. And then there may be some persecution. There may be some blackballing. There may be some, all of a sudden, because if anybody's had this happen to more than a dozen times, it's me. I got to sit back and say, wait a minute. Do I take the wrong suffered? Do I suffer? Do I take the hit? Do I take the injustice? And say, Lord, I'm trusting you. I'm not going to get in the flesh and try to fix it, try to work something out here. Because the minute I get in the flesh and get into the system of doing something, grace is removed, and now it's all flesh. This war I've created now is going to be all flesh. God can't move in it because old Greg moved in. See, when I move into it, the injustice, I move God out of the injustice. If I want a God outcome, I stay out and put God in so I can the outcome can be God's, not mine. I don't want an Ishmael to arrive out of this dilemma. I want an Isaac. Isaac represents promise. Ishmael represents the works of the flesh. So when God performs something by promise, that's staying out of the tent. Isaac didn't come out of the tent. And remember, Paul equates the tent to the 10 Commandments, any type of list, any type of do this, don't do that, principles, keys, spiritual laws, that's all in the tent. Isaac can only come out of waiting for God to perform the promise. And that's what it says in Romans chapter 4, around 20, 21, 22. Abraham trusted because he knew God was faithful to perform what he promised. Who's the performer? When you have an injustice, who's the performer? Me, if I get in there and try to fix it. Him, and let grace rule the situation and get a God outcome, not an Ishmael outcome. I want an Isaac out of this thing, not an Ishmael. If you want an Isaac out of situations, circumstances, get your hands off of it and trust God. Yes, it hurts. Yes, you'll suffer. And yes, they're going to think something that's not true of you. That's the hardest one, to try to vindicate yourself. I know there are people that think things about me that I know isn't true. And I could call them on the phone and say, hey, that's not, number one, they're going to believe me? Probably not. And it makes me even look more guilty, so just let it go. They think I'm guilty anyway. And I'm going to let God vindicate me. And guess what? God may not vindicate you. You may, in that person's mind or that group of people, they may think that about you the rest of your life, but I am not going to, I'm giving it to God. Now remember the guy when David was leaving Jerusalem and had to leave because Absalom was taking over? And rather than fight his own son and fight for the throne, this is what David said. David said, you know what? If God wants me back in this palace, reigning from the throne, He'll put me there. I'm not going to kill my son Absalom. He'll put me there. That's pretty much what he thought about when Saul was king. David had already been anointed to be king, and yet Saul was still king. He says, if I kill him, I can be king. But I'm not going to do it the flesh. I'm going to do it God's way. I'm not going to be the one that takes Saul out. And none of my people are going to be the one that takes Saul out. Although that's what happened. And he was mad at the guy for taking Saul out. But nevertheless, He says, I'm not going to make anything happen. I'm not going to get in the flesh and hurry this thing up. It took David 18 years to get to be king in Israel. But he wasn't going to take Saul out. And so it took 25 years for Abraham to have Isaac. And God says, look, you can go the way of the flesh and produce an Ishmael. And Ishmael is your modern day Arabs today that are constantly fighting with the Jews who come from Isaac. Jesus came from the line of Isaac, and your modern day Arabs come from the line of Ishmael. And we've got this war to this day, this holy war that's still going on because it is what it is. You can blame all ISIS and terrorism is all from Ishmael. Did you know that? You may not have known that. And even your Muslims, your Islam believes Abraham is their father. So do we. We both believe in Abraham, but one comes from Ishmael, and the other side comes from Isaac. So the Jews come out of Isaac, and your modern day Arabs come out of Ishmael. Still fighting today. But Paul spiritualizes it, and those who are of the law, legalists, are fighting those who are free, grace-oriented people. And it's a spiritual more than a lineage thing today, because now it's not a lineage thing today. It's a spiritual thing today. Spiritual children. Those who are of faith are the children of Abraham, and that could be any race, anybody at that point. So, but let me get back and close with this. Do you understand that when you try to take up for yourself and you try to fix the thing, you're removing grace? Suffer. Take the hit, suffer, because grace there, you're letting God be involved, God to fix the thing, and maybe God doesn't want to fix the thing and wanted it to be something else anyway. Look, you're in the purpose of God, and the plan of God, and the will of God. No one's going to take you out. So just go ahead and get out of the battle and let God fight your battle. Let grace reign in the situation. Don't produce an Ishmael in the thing. Don't get in the flesh and try to get in the tent and try to fix this thing by your works of the flesh. Back off. Take the hit, because you're letting grace, which is God, in the situation and circumstance. Because I want a God outcome. I don't want a fleshly outcome. Oh, you may win, and you may get what you want, but if you did it, I can guarantee you it's an Ishmael. But if God does it, by promise, it's all Isaac. It's all by promise, and man, nothing, and no one can take that away from you. When God ordains something, but if you've ordained it, you manipulated to get this, to get that, to get your way, folks, you are producing an Ishmael, and sooner or later, he's going to say to you what he said to Abraham: cast the bondwoman out in the sun. Ishmael's got to go. And what's Abraham say? Oh, if I may have Ishmael before me. What does that mean? God, let me do something. Let me have some work of the flesh. Let me see where I've done something with my IQ, my ingenuity. When Abraham said, oh, that I might have Ishmael before me, he was basically saying, just let me do something that I can say I did this. Because remember what Paul says in Romans 3, no boasting. And if God let Ishmael stay, Abraham could have boasted about his tent meeting. Look at Isaac. This is Isaac, but over here's Ishmael. God says, oh, no. The flesh and the spirit, the works of the flesh and the fruit of the spirit don't jive. Either it's by promise, which is all God, or it's by the law, and it's all you. Ishmael comes from the law. Isaac comes from promise. Let it go. Anything in your life, let it go. Do you know how freeing that is? To where I don't have to vindicate myself, man. I don't care about my reputation. You realize that now in my younger years, you got to really protect that reputation, because if you don't get your reputation, you ruin your witness. Man, I've found out those who are the greatest Christians have a bad reputation with somebody, because you're going to always do something to make somebody mad. Let it go. Don't fight for your reputation. Don't fight for your job. Don't fight for anything. If you've got to fight for it, maybe either it's got to go because God's doing something new, or God's testing you. You're going to produce an Ishmael. You're going to let me do it by promise. You're going to go to the tent. Or are you going to let me do it by promise? I know I've said a lot, and man, I just really feel like there's so much more to be said, but we're out of time. And I just want you to see that going into that tent is a no-no. And I say put a no trespassing sign outside the tent. Don't even go there. Don't even engage it. Don't even go around it. Because the minute you go in there, you're in trouble. You've fallen from grace. Going into that tent, Paul equates to law of any sort, biblical principles, spiritual laws, keys, secrets, all the stuff that the church tells you to do. Going into that tent is simply falling from grace. So join us next week on the NRZ, the No Religion Zone. We'll continue this, and we're going to get some good stuff as we go along. God bless you. See you next week.